발표 잘 들었.
Thank you for the presentation. I think that after the emergence of COVID-19, I thought that there was going to be a new crisis for the container and maritime industry. However, we can take this crisis and turn it into an opportunity. And I think that that was a hopeful message that we just heard from Mr. Tim Power of Jewelry. Thank you for the presentation. We'll now move on to the second presentation, which will be given by someone with much sharp insight. He is very famous for his cutting insight. In fact, he is the CEO of Sea Intelligence Consulting, Lars Jansen, who will be talking about uncharted territory. We'll go straight into the presentation now.
Hello, my name is Lars Jensen, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak here at the 8th BIPC, although I'm of course sad that I could not be in person in wonderful South Korea, but I guess that will have to wait for another time. What I'm going to share with you here are some of my thoughts and analysis on what I've called uncharted territory. Aside from the pandemic, 2020 is basically a dividing year where there is quite a number of developments in the container shipping industry. That means the short-term future is extremely unpredictable, and the long-term future, we will see some structural changes that we have not seen before. So let me take you through that. Just as a very quick starting point, before we had the virus impact, in January 2020, as we entered 2020, we actually had market conditions that for the last 4 years had been deteriorating. Global demand growth had gone down to 0%. That was at the beginning of this year. So the market did not start off on a strong footing. At the same time, we had the impact of the new low sulfur rules, where all the container lines had to pay for the much more expensive fuel. And if you look at the price of the low sulfur fuel versus the normal fuel in January, again before the pandemic, the premium that had to be paid was extremely high. It actually went up to $300 per ton more than what we paid last year. The reason I'm mentioning this, it will become important towards the end, is that despite the weak market conditions where demand was basically at 0% growth and carriers still having substantial amounts of capacity, the carriers were actually able to pass through these additional costs. That in itself was somewhat unprecedented, that despite weak market conditions, carriers were actually able to pass through significant rate increases due to the low sulfur rule. Then, of course, we had the impact of the virus itself. The way I see it right now is that it's had 5 different phases. We had phase 1, which was when the virus was only in China and Chinese manufacturing shut down. What I'm showing here is simply the amount of blank sailings the carriers canceled on the Trans-Pacific and Asia-Europe combined. The light red is what was already canceled due to normal seasonality from Chinese New Year. The bright red is what was caused by phase 1 virus in China. Phase 2 was when China began to open up and the rest of the world had not really been impacted yet. That was a very brief period of just a few weeks, but they were important. Phase 3 is when the virus spread globally and we had a significant ramp up of blank sailings again. Phase 4 was more of a stabilization after the virus was partially under control. Phase 5 with a question mark is the phase we're in right now, where we are seeing a bit of a split, with some markets still not performing well, other markets, especially the Trans-Pacific, seeing a boom the like of which we've basically never seen before. The yellow blank sailings here, just for good measure, those are the ones related to Chinese Golden Week and are therefore more seasonal than virus related. During all of these phases, the shipping lines were actually able to solidify freight rates. Not only did they maintain rates, despite the collapse, we actually saw increasing freight rates. And the key for that was a rapid uptake in the number of blank sailings. This is the early phase during phase 1, reaching into phase 2, where you see the blue ones are the seasonal blanking of sailings. The red ones are the ones that are up on top of it because of the pandemic. On the Trans-Pacific, we see that for a couple of weeks, basically half of the market capacity had been eliminated. On Asia-Europe, we had 3 weeks where it was basically half of the capacity that was taken out of the market. And once the virus was under control, seemingly in China, it was also very, very quick until the amount of blank sailings went to almost nothing, and we head into phase 2. The cargo that was backlogged in China got loaded, blank sailings revert to normal, we have full vessels departing China, and here's the key problem. In the period from the point where this cargo was loaded in China until the vessels then actually arrive in North America and Europe, North America and Europe started shutting down. So all of this cargo that had been loaded was now being delivered into an environment where a large amount of importers did not really want to take delivery. This caused a lot of bottleneck issues in ports and in the hinterland, as well as in the warehouses. Then we were into phase 3, which was the second round of blank sailings. At this point in time, we had a month where more than 20% of the capacity on the Trans-Pacific was out of action. And for Asia to Europe, we had more than a month where it was 25, ranging up to almost 40% of capacity that was simply removed. We have never in the history of containerization seen carriers remove that much capacity that quickly. It was quite simply unprecedented. But this is also why they were able to again increase freight rates despite an extremely poor demand market. The phase we're into now is somewhat split. In Trans-Pacific, we effectively have no blank sailings. The graph shows a few blank sailings, but that's basically down to normal. We always, once in a while, see some blank sailings. Whereas on Asia-Europe, we still have an element of blank sailing. So there is right now different market conditions in the two trades, with the Trans-Pacific seeing an unprecedented demand boom, whereas Asia-Europe is picking up, but not yet to the degree seen on the Trans-Pacific. As mentioned, this strengthened freight rates. On the contract rates, we are basically up 10% compared to last year. This is in an environment, mind you, where fuel prices this year are lower than what they were last year. The spot rates is even more extreme. In Q1, when the virus predominantly was in phase 1, we saw a 10% increase compared to last year. Q2, when the virus spread and became a global pandemic, freight rates were now up 15%. And in Q3, the SCFI index for spot rates is now up a full 50%. Most of the deep sea trades out of China measured by the SCFI have record high levels. This is entirely unprecedented. Furthermore, the capacity discipline we see from the carriers is something we have never seen them do to this degree before. The closest thing we can compare to is the financial crisis a decade ago. At that point in time, it took the carriers 3 to 4 months before they could effectively remove capacity. This time around, both in phase 1 and in phase 3, the carriers removed substantial amounts of capacity inside of a single week. The reason for this is the consolidated nature of the market. Right now, we basically only have 3 main alliances that need to coordinate internally to make this happen. And even there, the carriers that are members of these alliances are much larger and more consolidated than what we saw in the market 10 years ago. This is here to stay. They instantly get a benefit of their own capacity reductions, and they can much more granularly adjust this level of capacity. So despite the pandemic, and we should think when the pandemic is over, the market reverts to normal, when it comes to capacity discipline, this should be seen as normal. The carriers now have an ability where they can adjust capacity tactically, basically from week to week. And we should expect going forward, this is the new normal. On the demand side, we're actually seeing to some degree a rebound. This is the global demand growth, where we see the massive dip in spring, but we are now seeing the newest numbers from Container Trade Statistics are from August. We now actually have positive growth. However, this is slightly misleading because this is the global number. If we split it down by region, what we see is most regions are still performing poorly on demand. The real key here is the substantial growth specifically on North American imports. This is what is skewing the entire global market. And if we look underneath what is driving this unprecedented peak, it's the behavior of the US consumers. On the left-hand side, what you see here is a 60-year timeline, all the way back from 1959, showing the American consumer, how much of their money do they spend on goods, how much do they spend on services. And of course, over time, they've been spending relatively more and more on services. But if you look at the right-hand side on the graph, This shows how much do their spending patterns change between goods and services. And what you see at the end is extremely large spike. This is a shift away from services onto goods that is of a magnitude that has never been seen before in the last 60 years, which basically also means the change in consumer behavior is something we have never seen in the entire history of container shipping. If we look closer at the American consumer, what you will see on the blue line here is goods, and the orange line is services on the left-hand side. And we see goods, yes, that is definitely up, has been for months. This is why we're seeing a lot of goods moved into North America. But the procurement of services is down. Reality is, the US, like most other countries in the world right now, is in a recession. Consumer spending is down. What is entirely unprecedented is this shift, which means that even though consumer spending is down, we see more goods being moved in. And it's especially the durable goods, the stuff that takes up a lot of space in containers. This is for gardening projects, it's for home improvement projects, it's for establishing the new home offices. Everything is being moved over right now. But the question is this a sustainable shift? We have never seen anything, as I mentioned, in the history of containerization matching this. On top of that, we also have a record low fleet order book. The order book right now amounts to about 10% of the global fleet. This is lower than anything we have seen in the last 15 years. So when we're looking slightly further ahead, the carriers have a choice. They can either go and order a large amount of vessels again, or they can maintain a low order book, which means the tight supply situation could actually persist for a substantial period of time. If we look very close to developments right now, Golden Week, if we try to look at what is the normal seasonality of freight rate behavior, in this case Asia North Europe, Asia US West Coast, the red and orange lines are different depiction of normal seasonality. The blue lines is what the freight rates are actually doing. We're seeing freight rates around Golden Week develop in a way that is completely inconsistent with normal seasonality around Golden Week. This is yet another element where 2020 is showing developments that are totally out of alignment with what is normal. So if we are to look forward, there are basically two key conclusions that are important here. In the near-term future, we are faced with an extreme degree of uncertainty. Demand growth on every single trade lane around the world right now is extremely uncertain. It depends on shift in consumer spending. It depends on stimulus packages where governments have different views in every single country around the world. It depends on inventory changes. All of this is actually more important than the economic fundamentals. We are literally in unprecedented territory. There are none of the normal models linking macroeconomics into container shipping that are functioning right now. Secondly, we have now several times this year shown the carriers to have an extremely high capacity discipline. They are gaining from it. They will have the most profitable year in more than a decade here in 2020. This is again a new norm and unprecedented territory. Spot rates now are being driven not only by vessel capacity, but by constraints. We have equipment shortages, and again, this is unpredictable because the usual trade imbalances have been skewed beyond recognition because of all these pandemic impacts. We are seeing port congestion because, again, of these uncertain shocks to the demand. In the US, for example, we are seeing chassis shortages. So rates are not only now determined by supply and demand, but also very local bottleneck effects. On top of that, cyber attacks is becoming more and more mainstream in the industry. Recently, we saw CMA CGM. That means that over the last 3 years, the four largest container lines have all been subjected to successful cyber attacks. These should not be seen as unusual. This is again part of a pattern that is increasing, not decreasing. And adding to top of all that uncertainty, we have the global targets for CO2 emissions for 2030 and 2050, which means we already know the vessels that are in existence today will not be able to solve the target for 2050. We can see a transition to LNG vessels. That is known technology, but we also know for a fact that that will also be insufficient to meet the 2050 targets. So summing all of this up, if we look near term, I would say, the next 12 to 18 months, it is presently literally impossible with any degree of certainty to predict what will happen to demand and with freight rates. If we look more long term, one thing that we can say with a reasonable degree of certainty is that the capacity discipline we have seen the carriers bring to bear, that is here to stay because it works, and it's a result of a 20-year drive towards consolidation. But when it then comes to what will happen with the order book, that again becomes highly uncertain because the vessels you can order today, we already know they will be insufficient for the requirements of the future. So that was the thoughts I wanted to share with you here. I thank you all very much for listening, and thanks for the invitation to speak here.
So we've just heard from Mr. Tim Power, but I think that Sea Intelligence Consulting, working at a global alliance, I think that I'm well aware with Mr. Tim. I am well familiar with him, but as for Mr. Lars Jensen, as the MC has said, he's a man of a clear insight. He was really giving us so much extensive information. His coverage was really all over the place that I found it very difficult to stay on top of all of his messaging. I think that what he said, if we compare it to Mr. Tim Power, essentially their perspectives are the same. That in the past, there was all this overcapacity with the shipping lines, and in the last 4 years in particular, the market conditions in the maritime industry were quite poor. However, another development was due to the high sulfur and low sulfur fuel. This spread between these two fuel costs was quite high before COVID-19 in the early part of this year. He said that there are about 4 phases after COVID-19. The first phase was when COVID-19 struck China, and after there was some recovery in China, led to phase 2 and then phase 3 when there was global pandemic, and phase 4 was a bit of a stabilization, and then phase 5 is where we are right now. A lot of these changes happened to us, and what is really surprising is similar to what Mr. Tim Power said, that about 10 years ago, when there was a recession with the global financial crisis, the alliances and the carriers at the time, when there was a sharp decrease in demand, it took them about 3-4 months to manage the capacity. But now, what was surprising is that within just 1 week, they were able to tighten their capacity. So they were very quick and resilient to adjusting to these changing market conditions from the demand side. So they were able to do really quick movements in terms of space utilization and capacity management. That this was unprecedented. In fact, beginning in June, these shipping liners enjoy the most profitability over the last 10 years or so. So that is what he said. I think that his key message was uncertainty, and that short term there is uncertainty, 18 months down the road it's uncertain, and even long term everything is uncertain. However, these issues of uncertainty are somewhat demand-based, and over the last several decades or so, the biggest market, if you look at the North American or the US market, many of the consumers have been paying more on services rather than goods, but now that has shifted over. In the past 3 months, we have seen something that is very unique, which is that because of COVID-19, the governments around the world have been spending a lot in terms of stimulus packages. So a lot of demand spikes occurred around the countries, around the world, and that was very unusual as well. And he did talk about the rate making. 3 of the major lines have been impacted by cyber attacks as well. That's also another uncertainty issue. And CO2 emission is also what he mentioned. That long term, there's the EU carbon tax movements that we're also seeing in that market. So there's going to be a lot of changes in the global market. So that is something that he mentioned. And also going forward, the order book as well. If we look at the order book for new fleets, because these carriers are facing so much uncertainty, as we've seen with all the blank sailings earlier on, they're either idling their capacity or just waiting to see to place new orders. If we look at the golden week, a peak period seasonality, we have not been able to see a lot of factors around seasonality. So both short term, mid term, even long term, there's going to be a lot of uncertainty. It's an unprecedented world that we are living in for most of the liners. So he did mention many different points in that regard.